Everyone.
Hello. Hi.
I got your message, and that's totally fine, of course.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. Hopefully we'll get a couple of other people coming. Senior Connections said that they thought that we probably wouldn't meet today because it was a holiday, which had I thought of Columbus Day or Indigenous Peoples Day as a holiday, I would have skipped, but everyone I know is working. Is anyone here off today? No, yeah.
Oh.
I'm all for more holidays.
I was going to say, I wish I was off.
No. More holidays, the better. I wonder if the city and the county have it off. I remember there was some day that we got off. That was years ago when I worked for the county, and it was not a good day. I think it was Columbus Day, and we decided to boycott the day off because we didn't lose Columbus Day. Which is a little self-defeating, but yet I am going to start sharing my screen just so that you guys have the opportunity to start looking at it. Let's go back down. Today is a fun-packed session. The next, this is the last of sort of the really dense sessions where I'm like shoving information at you guys. After this, the next two are like really nice, kind of fun. It's all about design. So unless design makes you really unhappy, it would be really nice. Nice to do. Okay. So I'm going to start like I usually do by just orienting you to what we're going to do today. We probably, we aren't going to have any breakouts or anything today. It's all going to be together. And so if you have something that you want to communicate, please do. Or if you feel, and then, you know, we may pause for a minute to work on something, but there are so many different slides I want to be able to show you about sort of thinking about different ways of thinking about the data that I want to make sure that we get to do that. But in the workbook, we've got a whole little section, and I'm going to talk a little bit about this today, about how all data analysis is biased. And so we're going to talk a little bit about sort of how to manage that. There's also a little thing that we won't talk about today, but it's like, when do you need a database and how do you know? And so I have some of that up there. We have survey key. These graphs for the Insight and Learning team I present in the PowerPoint, but they're here so that they're bigger and more of them. And there's a description, which we do go over. And then what I also have is I have a whole bunch of resources on core Excel skills. So if you're really good at Excel, fabulous. And if you're not, there are some YouTube channels and some trainers that I really like. Really, you can pretty much Google anything in Excel and get a little video of it. And so I want to make sure that you guys have that. And then I talk about the difference between percentage point difference, percent change, and percentage difference, which can get people a little bit confused. So I have it written down. And a couple of other fun little math things, critical graphs. And then I have a bunch of things that are nice to have, but not important. So this is really, this particular chapter of the workbook, I think, has lots of really nice resources that you're probably going to want to connect with later. And let me reshare. We'll go to the presentation. Okay. So anyone who is already doing budgeting or any kind of budget analysis, this really isn't very different, but I think it does tend to stress people out. because there's something about data analysis that feels really sort of beyond us, but it's really not beyond any of the math skills that you have. And so we are going to talk about them today. And this is the last step in being confident in the model, right? So first you have the framework, which is a strategic impact map. You've got your statement about why what you do should work, which is your impact statement. And then you create your surveys, and we talked about survey creation last time, and now we're doing some data analysis. We're going to talk about why that is, how to do that and what's helpful about it. And then you've got your package, you've got what you need, and the next pieces are how to talk about it. So today is a toolkit, and we're also going to talk about this thing I called insight and learning teams, which helps you turn data into knowledge and then actually into action. Okay. So I had said you don't need any more skill than you do in managing your budget, and that is true because you do not need statistics. Statistics are used to test hypotheses, and hypotheses are guesses that scientists think are going to happen when they run an experiment. And it doesn't let you know whether or not anything is a big effect or a small effect, whether it's important or not important. All it does is it mathematically lets you know whether or not your result might be due to chance. And that really is not important when you're dealing with individual people, because when you're dealing with individual people, the results are literally the results, right? Like people are telling you what they experienced, and they're also showing you what they've gotten. And that is just true. There's no need to test that to see if it's true. The only thing you might ever want to do if you have enough people, and actually I think probably the senior connections is the only place that has enough people, is you could look to see whether or not there was a disparity. So you could look to see whether or not, white folks versus Black and brown folks had different impacts, or men or women had different impacts, using something called a risk ratio, which you can actually calculate by hand. And I did put that in the workbook just in case you care. But that's it. So then you might say, that the African-American children are twice as likely to get a school referral than the white children. And that would be an important thing to know. But that's kind of as fancy as I've ever had to do any statistics for any organization. And I still don't use just anything statistically significant because that's meaningless. It just is what it is. The other thing about statistical significance that's important is that the way that the math works is that anytime you have a very, very big effect, so like if you are looking at brains, and you notice that people who had dementia had smaller brains and people who didn't have dementia had bigger brains, then because that size would be consistent because it was just true, you could have like 10 people and you could get a statistically significant difference because the difference was big. Or you could have a very small difference, but if you study it lots and lots and lots of people, the more people you have, the more likely it is to be statistically significant. So this is how we know that taking aspirin can be good for heart attacks. It's not because it actually prevents that many heart attacks. The size of the benefit is small, but because we can study it in lots and lots of people, we know that it actually works. So if that makes your head spin, you just don't think about it anymore because you don't need to worry about it. Because you are not scientists. Jeremy's like, I got it. You're not scientists, you're not testing hypotheses, you're dealing with individual people and usually just a small number of people. And it's not your mission, right? It's the mission of scientists. Your job is to describe what it is that your clients are experiencing and use that information to tell a story about what it is you're doing and how people are getting, or hopefully not getting, what it is you're providing. If you want to read a little bit about statistics, I have this little blog that I wrote not too long ago. Some of you might have seen it come through. It's all you need to know about statistics in under 300 words. So there's 298 words, I think, about statistics. And then underneath is this conversation about not needing them. For most of you, and actually also Christine, for most of the things that she's doing, really only need Excel. So if you have less than 500 rows, so each row is going to be a person, then you actually can use Excel for almost everything. After that, it starts to get a little clunky. But I even have some suggestions for that, like splitting your population up if that's possible. And the only reason it gets clunky is because the more worksheets and the more data you have, the slower Excel gets, and it stops being useful to see it. And once it's not useful to see the data, then you might as well be using some statistical tool. However, Excel is accessible, it's useful. Since you don't need statistics, it's fine, and it is actually incredibly powerful. Questions about Excel before we go on? Yeah, Jeremy?
Yeah. Would you say everything should be the same for Google Sheets? Because we tend to use Google Sheets
Yes.
more than Excel. It's the same applies.
It is the same. So there's actually a guy, and this is in your workbook too, who sends out like weekly Google Sheets tips, like Google tip sheets or something. So you can, if you don't have a subscription to something like that, he's a good one. The only thing that I don't like about Google Sheets, and I think the only thing it doesn't do as well as Excel, is graphing. So because it's shared, it doesn't like to format things as nicely as Excel. So a lot of times what I'll do is I'll actually collect my stuff in Google Sheets, download it to Excel and do it in Excel because it's a little quicker if my connection isn't great and the ability to format is stronger in Excel.
Great.
All right. The next thing I want to stress is that you cannot get quality results out of bad data. Everybody here, your data is going to be a little bit variable because you're not scientists, you're not going to all your staff every day and teaching them, how to think about entering data so that it's all entered in well. But if you want good data, data entry should be part of your job requirements. You should talk about it at staff meetings. If there are data that are challenging for staff to enter in, like, well, I got this weird answer or this weird characteristic from somebody, I'm not sure if it goes in category A or category B, that should be a group discussion. Because if it's a group discussion, then everybody does it the same way. And if people are doing it all sorts of different ways, then you're going to run your analysis in the end and you're not going to know what it is you have because people will have defined things differently. So it's important to have people trained up on data and have constant conversations about how people are entering data. The other thing that is ideal is if the data serves the staff and the staff isn't just serving the data. For some organizations, like I could see for Miracle Messages, maybe staff don't really need to see the data because they're not case managing or they're not trying to follow something. But if you are following something, then the data should be there to help you follow it. At least in the for-profit world, there is some evidence, it's not hugely great, but I can imagine that this would be the case, that if people actually have access to their data, they're more likely to perform better because they know where they are with their achievements and what they need to do. And so even if your staff aren't able to look at your data on a daily basis to help them do their job, I feel like staff deserve to be able to look at the impact and think about what they're doing and whether or not there's any way in which they can adjust what they're doing in order to get better impact, which is really, honestly, in my opinion, the better reason to have data than to tell your story. The main reason to have data is for people to look at it and for you guys to continuously improve what you're doing. Why didn't that thing work out? That's weird. Look, 3 people in the month of June had blah, blah, blah. What was that? Oh, that was when Chrissy was on maternity leave. Oh, yeah, well, we're going to have to really pay attention to that because next time staff leave, it seems like having that same staff there is really important for success. That's an example of how your data can actually inform your programming. The other thing is that what I think a lot of folks don't fully appreciate is that when your programming changes, your data sometimes need to change because what you're doing and how you're entering that data and what that data actually is reflecting might be something different. So maybe you start off with like 3 groups of clients, right? Client group A, B, C, and they each get a set of services. But then maybe group A splits into 2 groups, just organically, like the staff starts doing something differently with group A1 and A2. Well, then you actually need to figure out when you need to split that data and have 4 groups, because if you then start to look at the success of that group A that is actually getting 2 different things, because that's what the staff decided was really important, which might be really good, then your impacts might be impacted. Your impacts might be affected. You might not have the same kind of results because you're not actually doing the same things with people. So those are all things to kind of think about, and honestly, things you can just email me about, or even send out to the ImpactStory network and say, this kind of happened, what do you guys think? And I encourage you to do that anytime you're comfortable, because I'll still answer, but then everybody has the benefit of being able to kind of learn from each other. Okay, this is how we take data and we turn it to action, and that action might be storytelling, which might result in funding or volunteers, or social media hits or newspaper articles, or it might be internal actions like improving your program or counseling your staff, or getting more resources in order to be able to do something better. And there are 3 steps. The first step is entering your data and kind of just getting it into Excel. The second step is cleaning and analyzing your data and graphing it. And then the third step is taking those graphs and sending them to your insight and learning team so that they can start to figure out what it means. So in this way, you're going to end up having your data become graphs. Your graphs and the experience of the people reading the graphs is going to make them understand what the data means. And then they're going to take that understanding and they're going to put meaning to it. Like, well, what does that mean happen? And that creates knowledge. So you get from data, understanding, to knowledge, and that knowledge you can use to create action. So I'm going to take you through each of these steps. Very importantly, in the main ImpactStory Google Drive, there's a folder that says extra videos, which you may or may not have looked at before. There's a lot of extra videos in there, and I'll show you today when those videos come up. But instead of walking you through the Excel sheet and go clicking, I took a video of me doing that. And that Excel workbook is also in the folder. So you can watch the video, you can see the Excel workbook, and then I put clean data at the end so you can try doing it yourself. So you have all the opportunity to practice it. But today I'm going to take screenshots of that data and just walk you through what happens. So sometimes you're going to enter in your data on paper. And if that's the case, you want to number each of your pieces of paper and then number them in your rows in Excel, because I guarantee you at some point you're going to want to go back and figure out, wait a minute, what was the answer to that? That sounds really weird. And then when you're entering scales, or when you're programming them into Google Forms or SurveyMonkey or something like that, you want 1 to always be your least desirable, and for your desirability to go up. And anything that is skipped or not applicable, or people don't know, or they prefer not to answer, you just want to leave that blank. That way, this allows you to be able to count and sum your data in the most efficient ways. So scales always go from 1 strongly dissatisfied to like 6 strongly very much satisfied, and then everything else is blank. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. When possible, get your data entered in by your participants. Have them be able to do it electronically, because that saves on data entry and error. So here's a screenshot of some raw data that was brought in from SurveyMonkey. And you can see I brought it in on a raw data. I labeled the file, the page raw data. And you can see it's got a start date, an end date, an IP address, and everybody's answers. Once I have the raw data, I'm going to create a cover page. And you want to create a cover page because data gets confusing really quick. And it's really nice to have more than the title of the file to help you understand what's going on in it. So all you do is you create a worksheet before your raw data, and you unclick view grid lines, and it just looks like a sheet of paper. And you might want to include where the data came from, and who collected it, and who analyzed it. And if you're changing your words to numbers. What is the, if a 1 is a strongly disagree, then you want to have 1 is strongly disagree, so that you have something that you can refer back to. And you can put all sorts of other kind of information in there. And so this is what the cover sheet looks like on the worksheet that I have in your Google Drive. So here's like the resume building and job searching course, and the instructor and the date and who it was analyzed by. Here are all the responses. And then I put here, just for you guys, what kinds of formulas I have in it. And what I also did for you guys is I hyperlinked all the videos. So if you just open it up, you can click on those videos and you can watch me go through the whole thing. Okay, so that's pretty easy, right? You download your data, you create a cover sheet, you're getting there. So what I do then is I copy the raw data sheet into a brand new data sheet and I retitle it cleaned. And then I never touch the raw data again. Because if you touch the raw data, you've messed up whatever it is that was entered or downloaded, and it gets really confusing. So all the manipulations I do on that clean data. Then worst case scenario, I can delete the clean data and I can start again with the clean data set. What I also do is that if there is some sort of ID in the raw data, I keep that and then I delete all those extra columns from the clean data. So that way I can go back and check and see if there's a problem with the data, which I've had to do. But I don't have to look at like the IP address and the time it took to complete it, and all the other kind of, there's usually all these columns of information that get brought over when you download data. Okay. So then I look at the clean data and I look for errors. I look to see if anything needs to be deleted. Maybe there's an entire row that's empty. Maybe there's a row that says test, right? Whenever I create a survey, I go in and I test it and I try to mark it somewhere, maybe many places, test. And so I'll delete that. I sort of scan things to make sure that nothing jumps out. If your data is being entered in by the participant, it's probably going to be pretty clean. You might just decide you want to delete the empty ones. But if it's being entered by hand, every once in a while somebody's hand slips. And so you might have a 4-point scale and somebody enters in a 5 and you're like, well, that's no good. I do typically like to leave in partial surveys because that partial survey data is good sometimes. But there might be a point at which you're like, that's so partial, I don't even want to include it, and you can take that out. Also, I want to warn you that you will find most of your errors as you do your data analysis. So this is just a scan, looking around. Sometimes I might sort the columns and just sort of look at it, see if I can get some idea of what's going on in there. But then I usually find more data when I do my analysis. The next thing I do before I do my analysis is I go up to the top. So you have the title of all of your cells up at the top, right? Each question is at the top. Each person is at a row. And so between the title of the question and the first row of data, I put in a line and I color it in all black. So I just fill it black. And then I go to the bottom and I take 2 or 3 lines and I color them in all black. And this is because now I have some a box like around my data. And if I ever want to add more data, I can insert cells, and I've now created a template. And I can go back and use all of the stuff that's underneath. It also visually helps me be able to handle it. The next thing I do is I take all the open-ended data and I put it in another file. And we're not going to talk about open-ended data today, but that is one of the videos. You can actually take the data, you can sort it, you can identify it by themes, and you can graph it. So you can have your quotes and you can say how many people made this comment in their open-ended data. It's just a really short video, kind of fun. All right, so here's what a cleaned data sheet looks like. I've marked it clean. I've kept the IP address and the date, start date, because I don't have an ID number here. So these would be things that would help me identify the data with the raw data if I ever needed to go back. All the things I need to be blank or blank. So it's on here that I may search and replace. Like if I have do not not applicable. I might search and replace the whole thing and change not applicable to blank. Or I might change prefer not to answer to blank. So I've got all my blanks, and then I've got my row of black at the top and my 2 rows of black at the bottom. Does this make sense?
I'm not understanding the purpose of the black rows. Maybe you could explain that
Yeah.
again.
So I think I will later, but just in case I don't. Once you do this data, let's say this is your data for you know, your April work, right? And so you analyze all your April work, and down underneath these black lines, you've got all of your formulas and graphs and stuff like that. And now let's say you want to download your May work, March, April, May, your May work. Then what you can do is you can download your May data, select all your May data. You can insert it between the black lines. Then you can delete all the other data, and all of your stuff will populate. And so what it does is it just saves you from having to do it over and over and over and over again. Once you've created data analysis, you don't have to create that data analysis again.
Right. From creating new formulas, you're saying. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
So it's super helpful, super handy if you've got those, but you don't have to have them. I also think though these lines actually visually help me know where the data ends and where my analysis starts. Yeah, you gotta be saying, yes, me too. So there are 3 formulas and 1 math that you need to know in order to be able to do your analysis. The first one, which is the one that you're going to use the most, is equals counts. That means you're going to count how many instances of something happen for a question. You might also sometimes want to sum things, and you might sometimes want to take an average. And then you're going to want to look at percentages, right? Which is sort of an average, but not necessarily an average, right? Because it's over 100. So you might be dividing one cell by another so that you know what percent of people answered in a certain way. There are 3 ways in which you can change count and sums and averages. Well, there's 4 for count. So for count, if you do count equals count A, and then you open your parentheses and you drag down a column, it will tell you how many of those columns have something, how many of those rows have something in it. So if you look up here, this is a count A of this column, and it just tells me how many instances there are, how many rows there are. So now I know how many participants are in there. I don't have to do any math. Count if says, I want you to take that column, but I only want you to count it if it is equal to something. So let's say you want to count the number of women and men. You can say count if column B equals man, and it'll tell you how many men. Count if women, it'll tell you how many women. The third one is count ifs with an S. And what this does is it lets you count something in one row based on what's going on in another row. So maybe you want to know how many women are under 40. So you can say, count the age column and make it, if it's under 40, if the gender column is female. And so then you can count everything in a row. You can count some things in a row, or you can count some things on one row, depending on which category they're in another row. And that's how it works for sum and averages too, and it's super handy. This means that you do not have to use what's called pivot tables, which some people think are a lot easier, but I actually think are a lot harder because I can never quite remember which way something is going. And when I'm doing a pivot table, each time I want to look at a different segment of my population, you know, the old men or the young women, I have to manipulate my pivot table and then I lose my data. Whereas here, I can just write it into my formulas, and every time I put in data, that just updates, and I get to see it over and over and over again. So if you want to watch me go through these, I'm going to walk you through them in the next few slides, but if you actually want to watch me do the formulas, you can go watch that video. The other thing I want to make sure that you guys know is that you are going to make mistakes. And you're going to have to redo the analyses, sometimes several times, which is why it's nice to make a template, because it just happens. Like, it's just not possible not to do it without mistakes. Well, maybe there's somebody out there who's like really slow and very meticulous who can do it without mistakes, but that person definitely isn't me. I usually do the analyses. I look at it, something doesn't work out, like, well, how come I have that there and this here? And I change it, and then when I actually start looking at the graphs, I notice some things are wrong. Sometimes when I go to the insight team meeting where we're actually looking at the data, I realize something is wrong. And so don't feel bad, don't get like all upset, just factor in the fact that you're going to have to do a couple of sets of data analysis. And anytime you have an opportunity to create a template, create it, because that will cut out the problems later. Questions about these things before we go to the next slide. Okay. So here's an example of how you would use count up, right? So this is equals count up, open parentheses. You would drag down all the way up here at column A2, which is the first bit of data, all the way through count 18. If you have black lines, which this doesn't have, and I will have to add for next time, you want to include those black lines. They don't have any data in them, so it's not going to mess up any of your calculations, but you want to include those black lines. And then it just spits out what the answer is. Here, I'm using a count if statement. So here, I'm saying, I want to look at column C, and I'm saying, I want to look at column C 2 to 18 if the answer is B21, which is strongly disagree. And then you know what this allows me to do? It allows me just to take this one and drag it down, and it automatically counts it. Because I have to put, do you guys know about dollar signs, how dollar signs work in Excel? If you put a dollar sign before the C and a dollar sign before the 2 and a dollar sign before the second C and a dollar sign before the 18, it won't shift those. It'll keep it C2 to 18 all the way down. But if you leave B21 just without a dollar sign, as you drag it down, it will automatically know to go down a cell. So you will automatically have up here strongly disagree, disagree, agree, and strongly agree. Then you can drag it over here and change it. You'll probably have to change this number and drag it down. But there's a lot of dragging you can do in Excel to make it easier. Then here, all I'm doing is summing. Sum C21, C24. And that just gives me a sum. And now this sets me up to be able to get my percentages. So the first thing I do whenever I look at my data is I take each of the questions and I take each of the answers and I count how many of my response options I have for each question, and then I sum it so that I know how many I'm dealing with. You can see this question only has 16. Somebody left it blank. That's okay. So here I'm talking about the sum again, and then here's the percentages. So here I'm taking C21 and I'm dividing it by C17, and I get 47%. You have to format it as a percentage. And then I often highlight it in a different color because this is what I'm going to graph. It just helps me keep my data straight on my page. If you graph this and you graph this, the raw numbers versus the percentages, you're going to get the same picture. But in the percentages, you're able to see how much of the whole it is rather than just a number. And that's usually preferred. So sum and average and percentage. Honestly, this is what I spend 99% of my time doing. This is what I do most of the time when I'm doing my analysis. The only time I use some if and some ifs is once I'm starting to slice and dice the data and see if my results are different for females or men, or if they're different based on, level of poverty, or they're different based on social case manager, or maybe they're different based on age, or maybe they're different based on race or ethnicity. And so then I'm taking this exact same data, but I'm changing it to count if or count ifs, so that I can start slicing it into different groups. And knowing whether or not your data is different for different groups is actually pretty important, because if you're getting a result or you're not getting a result, and that's because one group is unaffected and the other group is affected a lot, because when you average that out, it's nothing, right? Unaffected, a lot affected, get to the middle. You want to be able to look at the differences between several kinds of demographic groups, or between your providers, or maybe between sites, or maybe between months. That part is up to you, but this is the core of everything that you're going to do. Here's an example of looking at how many men and women and non-binary folks there are in different age bands. So I do count ifs. I say if the gender is female, then I want to look at the age column, which is up above. I want it to be here. And I do that for each of those boxes, and then I'm able to graph it, and I'm able to see how many women, men, and non-binary folks there are in each age group. And I can use that same thing to say, instead of it being count ifs, I might want it to be count if, and I might be looking at count the strongly agrees for everyone who's female. And let's look at that compared to the strongly agrees for everyone who is male. So these slides, if you're not familiar with Excel, you're going to have to learn it, and that's going to be a little bit of a learning curve, just like when you learned QuickBooks. But if you know Excel, this is pretty simple and straightforward, and this is all you have to do. So you don't have to buy a new program, you don't have to launch a new program, you don't have to learn a new program, but you do need to learn a little bit about Excel. If you are, if you like learning by video, like I said, there's tons of videos I have in the workbook about how to, good YouTube posters that you can look to watch this happen. The second thing is that a colleague of mine named Ann Emery, who runs Depict Data Studio, who I've shown you guys a bunch of her stuff so far, she does an Excel basics, like she does what is it called? Simple spreadsheets. And she takes people through all these things, and what you get is you get live teaching, and then you get a library of videos that break this down into little tiny videos. And she is fabulous. She is on maternity leave because she had twins like 2 weeks ago. Her fourth and fifth baby, believe it or not. And I know. I don't know how anyone deals with more than two personally, and I was one of four, so I'm not criticizing. I'm just saying it's a lot of people. So she's not going to be teaching again until next year. But if you feel like you would like a nice tutorial on that, I think it's about $1,000, and you get office hours and live training, and then all of her videos. But there's plenty of YouTube videos out there that'll teach you how to do these things. And then there's the one I created for you that you'll have to. Okay, so you enter your data, you clean it, you calculate all your data, probably underneath your data, because it's easier to get the columns, and the row is easier to see what you're doing when you're doing it underneath. Then what you want to do is graph those, graph them. So you're going to have these sets of data, these tables that you're going to want to graph. And there's two types of graphs that you need. The video and graphing too. I tried to make them small, piece them out. One is when you have two groups you want to look at. So here we're looking at economically disadvantaged students compared to the whole student body. So when you want to look at two groups, you're always going to be using a bar graph. Sometimes the bar graphs are nicer this way, sometimes they're nicer this way. Doesn't really matter. I think when they're horizontal, they're called columns, and this time they're called bars. They're exactly the same thing. You set everything up the same way, but this is how you look at two groups of data. If you want to look at data over time, you use a line. And this helps you be able to see what's happening with people over time. Most of you aren't going to have over time data until you have at least 3 years of data, because otherwise you have two groups, year 1 and year 2, that you're just comparing, right? But after 2 years, you might want to look at your data over time. Or you might get data, this was data that was from a school system, and so the school system was able to give us several years of data. And so this is all you have to have. Questions about these, about the formulas or the graphs?
Is there ever a time you'll want to use a pie graph? Or
No.
no? Okay.
You could decide you want to use a pie graph, but I think pie graphs are only useful if you've got 2 categories. And any more than that, the pie graph starts to be unuseful. So I almost never end up using a pie graph. But it's very easy to use if you want to just go insert and you can just do a pie graph, but don't use it if you have got many categories. Use a bar. It's much easier to see the data and the categories and how big they are relative to each other if you use a bar. If you do use a pie chart, often using a donut chart is better. I'm going to show you some donut charts tomorrow, which is where the hole is out of the middle. And the reason people like that is because a donut chart is closer to a bar chart than it is a pie chart. It's just the bars, it's just the bar chart in a circle. And so it helps you understand the relativeness of the amount to each other better than a pie chart. But once you do that, why don't you just use bars? Or if you're just comparing men to women, why not just get a couple of graphics and just stick them on there, you know, and then put your number beside it. And that icon is actually going to be more meaningful and easier for your readers to grab than the pie chart anyway. Other questions? Who here is not familiar with Excel? Anyone? Yeah, all right. Yeah. Kelly and Gabby. Kelly, you guys really should take the Excel class, because when Ann has it open again, because it is incredibly helpful. She's got a second one called Great Graphs, where she teaches you all the ins and outs how to create graphs. And it has got to be, in my opinion, the easiest way to learn it.
Evelyn is so much more experienced with Excel.
Oh, great.
And
Okay.
generally she handles the majority of our data. She uses for the grant writing and things of that nature. So I don't necessarily need to use it as much as she does. I mean, I hate Excel. I love the finished product, but I hate actually using it. But
okay, so then
one
just
of us
put a
does.
few blinders, yeah, just to hold the concepts. Don't worry about the blinders. Once you get into Excel, I mean, I know people who use Excel for like almost everything, because it makes things, you can section things off easier than you can in Word. But it is a very, very powerful tool. And if you are not afraid of your data, which I hope you all get more comfortable with your data, it actually then can be really useful. Okay, here's the one thing that I'm going to potentially suggest that is more complicated. And this is called a jitter plot or B-swarm plot. And there's a little tutorial here, which I have used to create my own B-swarm plots or jitter plots. And the reason that you might choose to use this is because when you have groups and you look at the average, which is what this is, it hides the way in which the data spreads behind that average. And when you hide the way that data spreads behind an average, you can jump to conclusions more quickly. So here, this bar is here and this jitter plot is this bar. And if you look at these, you're like, wow, these averages are really different, right? This group must be doing something a lot more than this group, which on average is true. But it also looks like this group has a lot more people and is more evenly spread around, whereas this group actually does have people that score higher, but it's more bunched at the bottom and there's fewer people that score higher. And this is important because if this was productivity, then it would be good to know that whatever your group A and group B was, whether it was the men and the women or people who'd been there longer and people who'd been there less long, it's nice to know that behind the average is some distribution of that effect. Here's an example. So up here, I think I hyperlinked these to the article. Up here, it looks like, oh, look, all the purple people are smarter than all the green people. But when you jitter plot it, you start to be able to see the distribution, and then you're prompted to ask, I wonder what's going on here. Why is this group all clumped together and this group spread out? Which could be your answer. It's just the math behind the average. But it keeps you from stereotyping or creating bias around averages that say, oh, well, our new employees are really only about 66% as good as our current employees. And then when you do the jitter plot, our age or the ones that have been here for a while, when you look at the jitter plot, you're like, oh, wait, there's actually a group of our newer employees who are doing really well. Let's figure out what's going on with them. What were the characteristics of those people when we hired them? Does that make sense? That's helpful when you're trying to think about who to hire. It's critical when you're trying to look at differences between groups, especially when those groups have been disenfranchised. So if you're looking at men and women or Black and brown people compared to white people, it's really important to be able to look and see what the distribution of your data is. So if you want to, get your master's in data analysis as opposed to your bachelor's degree, which I'm giving you today, learn to use a jitter plot. Oh, and I want to talk a little bit about bias. So I'd said at the beginning that everybody has bias. There's no such thing as unbiased data, and it's 100% correct. And even scientists are prone to bias. So scientists have less variability, less noise, less extra stuff, less chaos that they're looking at their data with because they've created an environment and a controlled environment, and they have specific things they're testing, and then they're using fancy statistics to try to look at the relationships between what they're testing. But once they get that data, they can interpret it any way they want. And in 1994, a Harvard psychologist put out a book called The Bell Curve. Does anyone remember this book? Anyone around in 1994? So Christine was, in 1994, I was entering grad school. And so this was actually it was right before I entered grad school, but it was right before I entered grad school. And what these two guys said is that they said that Black people are inherently not as smart as white people because on average, they do less well on intelligence tests than white people do. And this caused a huge stir. And it's not that the data doesn't show that. The data shows, at least then, that Black people's scores on IQ tests were lower than white people's scores on IQ tests. And their interpretation was biased and racist. In 2003, I am pleased to be associated with Eric Turkheimer, was my stats professor, and Andriana Haley was one of the women in my group. They did a twin study, and what they showed is that if you have an individual who is who has the opportunity or the internal capacity to be a concert violinist, and they never get a violin, they never become a concert violinist. And so what they looked at is not that the color of your skin somehow magically makes you more or less intelligent. All of us in this room know that's not true. But what it does show is that opportunity creates opportunity. And that people who don't have access to the early learning, high quality education, those kinds of things, they're not going to do as well on an IQ test as people who do. And at least in the data that went up to 1994, most of the people who didn't have access to that were Black and brown people. And so if you just looked at the data, you could come to exactly the wrong conclusion. But what UVA showed was that, well, actually, if we use a different design, we can see that that's not the issue at all. And what the New York Times Magazine said is that being able to have multiple people look at the data, which is essentially what happened here, and to have multiple people interpreting the data is not just good science, but it's actually what makes a just society. You can use any of your data for good or evil. That's just the way that it is. You guys see data used for evil all the time in the news. And so in order for you to be able to use your data for good, you need to be able to look at it with openness, and you need lots of people looking at your data. And that's where we're going to get to the insight and learning team. So your insight and learning team, I'm going to tell you what it is in a minute, but this is a tool for turning your data into knowledge and your knowledge into action in the most inclusive way possible, so that whatever you're coming up with, whatever understanding of your data you have, is understood by a group and not just by you. Because if it's just understood by you, well, that means something to you, but it might not mean something to anybody else. And this is effectively what science does, because they publish their data and people can use their data and they can argue their data and stuff in the public forum, even though they're understanding it in their lab. But because you guys aren't scientists and not doing lab work, and you're not publishing your data for people to comment on and to re-look at, you're holding that ethics inside yourself. Okay. So who should be on your insight and learning team? I believe that it should be people with multiple perspectives. So there should be somebody who understands what's happening in the organization that might be changing the way the data is coming out. And that would probably be your executive director. You might want somebody who understands what's happening in the community, that is holding, like, well, these are the changes like that have been happening in our community, and that might be impacting the data. Could be a board member. You might want to have a program supervisor, because your program supervisor is going to have the biggest overall view of what's happening on the ground with the people being served. But that doesn't mean that you get to buy out of having a direct service provider, or if you have an opportunity, a past client who might also be a board member, be on your data team. Because your direct service provider or your past client, those are the people who really understand what it is to be the person receiving the service and what it means to actually receive the service and how that feels. And so if you've got those, that's really great. And then I like throwing in the development and marketing director, because they're the ones that are going to be using the data. And so if they're going to be using the data, it would be really nice for them to be able to understand it. Now, for a lot of you guys, these 6 positions are going to be 2 people. And that's okay. You're going to be using your hat all over the place as you think about it. You can only do what you can do. But you want to make sure that you have all those perspectives in your mind and that you're truly feeling open to perspectives when you're analyzing the data. Does this part make sense? And what kinds of questions do you guys have about this? All right. So once you've created your graphs in Excel or Google Sheets, you don't have to make them fancy at this point. All you want to do is copy and paste them. I like to paste them into PowerPoint because they're much easier to manipulate in PowerPoint. I used to put them in Word and they just flip all over the place and it becomes very hard. But PowerPoint is more like a bulletin board and you can stick stuff up anywhere. So I put the graph in and then see what I have here? I put a little statement next to the graph that says just what the graph says. Because a lot of times when people look at the graph, it takes them a long time to kind of orient to what it's saying. And so just having a little statement, even if you're not describing, like here, I didn't describe everything, but I described one thing so that people could look over and get oriented to what was going on, and not then, and it just makes it quicker. And so then I create a document that has all my graphs in it, and then I send it to my insight and learning team. And here's what I ask them to do. I say, guys, and they'll get better at this, right? The first couple of times you do it, it's going to be really painful. It's going to take a long time. People are going to be confused. You're going to be confused. You're going to have some data. You're going to have some data wrong. You're going to have to go back and do it. That's okay. By the third time you do it, it should be pretty easy for people to look at the data. They should be able to look at each graph. They should be able to mark it as whether it was expected or not. So was this, you know, is this good or bad? Is this expected good or expected bad? Is it surprising or important? Or do I need more information? And when you need more information, that could either mean I need some sort of slicing and dicing of the data. Like I see that this is how it is for everybody, but I need to know what it's like for actually just the people that were served by Sarah. Because I have a question about that. And then you can write down things that you think it means in the corner. So maybe, you know, an hour before the meeting or something, you start writing down, you know, this, I think this means that sales are, we're giving out more food, that more people are buying using their Virginia Fresh Match. I think this means that more elderly people are homebound. I think this means that we need different leadership at that senior center or something like that. I think this means we should probably be checking in on people. You just start tossing out what your hypotheses are while you're sitting by yourself. Then what you're going to do is you're going to come together and everybody's going to talk about the graphs and share what they think are the important things. And then once you've shared the important things, you're going to have identified some of the graphs you have to actually really understand. And here's where you want to make sure your culture is really positive. Because if you don't have a strengths-based, curious, open culture at your organization, if you're punitive, then you're going to sit down and have this meeting and no one is going to tell you anything you don't want to hear. And so you need to be able to have it be safe in this meeting for anybody to throw out any kind of crazy idea they might have. This is not a meeting to videotape. And to be able to discuss it, you know, can I throw out there that I think this might be, you know, John has really been irritable lately, and I'm really concerned about his mental health. And I think that's why these people might not be doing well. Can supervisor and I have that conversation? Or if you can't even say that, you can say, supervisor, I think I want to talk to you about a situation before we interpret this too far. It also means that people need to be able to say something like, you know what I think this is? I think this is just that we have not been doing enough at A. Because we're focusing on B, and I think not doing enough of A is resulting in this negative impact for people. And each time you're trying to understand what's going on behind the data, you want to make sure you get down to the root cause, and that's called asking the 3 whys. So you say, why are these numbers down? Well, they're down because, you know, I don't know, we had a harder time recruiting women. Why do we have a harder time recruiting women? Well, we had a harder time recruiting women because, you know, Janice left and we only have Earl, and Earl isn't as good at recruiting women. And then the question might be, well, I'm curious why Janice left, but you might also be like, well, why isn't Earl better recruiting women? What is it about Earl? Is Earl like a woman repulsor? Like, what's going on with Earl? Right? It might just be that Earl is shy. He doesn't like recruiting women. Okay, so let's go work with Earl and help him be less shy. Or let's put Earl's strengths to play well in another place, and let's bring somebody else in to kind of recruit. So you want to ask enough whys to really get down to what it is you really need to do. And that is knowledge. So if you can understand the graph, you can say, oh, we're not recruiting women as much, and you know that might be because Janice left. But once you know that you need a different way of recruiting women, that is and you all agree on that, that's consensus. And now what do you do about it? Well, there's lots of actions. You could fire Earl. You could reassign Earl. You could prioritize hiring another female recruiter. You could give Earl some extra support, have him go out with one of the female supervisors so that he gets a little more confident interviewing women. There is a lot of action you can take. But you don't know to take that action until you look at the graphs and you realize that the number of women are way lower now, and we know why that is. And so this is a process of discussing the data, and this is the most important process you have in discussing. This is how you learn everything. I suggest this happen once to 4 times a year. So often it might happen quarterly. If you have access to data, like if data comes in, if your impact data comes in quarterly, sometimes people's impact data just doesn't come in that often. Maybe they're only doing it every half year, every 6 months. Sometimes because of the leanness of the organization or the amount of data that you guys have, it might be better just to look at this annually and say, what do we want to do next year? But frankly, this is also at the basis of strategic planning, right? When you sit down with your, I mean, I've been in several strategic planning meetings as a board member where they put up some data on the screen or something like that, or they put up an impression like we think that, you know, this is happening or that's happening. And then we all get into little groups and we start to brainstorm what we think might be happening. And then they use that to try to create, you know, strategic priorities for the next year. This actually gives you data on which to base that. So it's not just people's impressions and ideas. There's data that you're rooting it in. So you're doing your own little internal programming and staff strategic planning quarterly, every 6 months, or annually, depending on how often your impact data comes in. Your productivity data you should be able to look at monthly, right? Because that's just counts. So as you're counting the number of people going through your door, you could just look at that data and, you know, maybe just 1 or 2 of you have a staff meeting and go, yep, we need more of this or less of that, or, oh, why are we getting more of those? But once you get your impact data, that data is usually comes in less often. So let me pause there about the strategy and this idea of using this insight team and having a culture that allows for brainstorming and honest discussion about the data and challenging each other, and see what kinds of thoughts you have. Is anyone, does this make sense? Does this feel like something you can imagine doing? Try it with 2 graphs, not all your graphs. Set people up and say, hey, let's talk about these. Let's see what happened. Here's, I mean, this is a common way people look at data, but once, many years ago, like 15 years ago, I was doing a little presentation for our Center for Nonprofit Excellence on data-driven decision-making. And so I asked our Boys and Girls Club to give me some data that I could graph and we could actually do like a little demonstration. And so they gave me some just attendance data, like who was enrolled. And I graphed it. And the director at the time, who isn't there anymore, but the director at the time said, oh my God, we talked for 3 days about that data. Because they had never graphed their enrollment data. So they hadn't seen how enrollment was changing over time. And once they had it, they had something that they could start talking about, start thinking about why is this happening to our recruitment? And what is it that we want to change? It could just be a celebration, like, hey, recruitment's going up. Or it could be like, wait, why are no 7th graders getting referred? So this is the process, this graphing of that data and sitting down and thinking about it and routinizing that, making it so that people know what to do. This is literally where the gold is. This is the purpose of doing all the work that you're doing. Does it take a while to set all this stuff up? Yeah, of course it does. But it took a while to set up your QuickBooks, and it took a while to set up your development database and stuff like that. If you prioritize data and you want to be able to make these kinds of decisions, you have to prioritize putting it into place. And so you can set a a work plan and you can work on it. I will tell you that I do currently do what I call coaching with people, where if you have an organization, there's someone in your organization that actually can do the data, like has it as their job, then I can come in and I can help set everything up. And what I do is I stay with the organization for 2 years, not because it takes 2 years of work to make it happen, but because data comes in and is used periodically. And so in that first year, we set everything up and we create all the templates and we collect the data and we look at it. And then there's going to be some changes. And then in the second year, I make sure that the organization has it institutionalized. Everybody is really clear on what it is that needs to go forward. So that's what I kind of think of when I think of setting this up. You set it up, that's a bit of a lift in the first year, but not extraordinary, just more than time than a lot of people have, but it's a thing, it's an investment. And then in the second year, you're really feeling how it works and starting to make adjustments to the system. A lot of you guys are super tiny. And so one of the things that I've figured out for that, and I'm starting to shop around at to funders. So if this is something you like, mention it to your funders, is to create a fractional data person. And so that fractional data person in the first year could help you set it up. And then going on could be the data capacity for the organization. And so for most tiny nonprofits with less than 4 people or less than $500,000, you only need about 3 hours a week on average of data support once it's up. And getting it up might take slightly longer than that and all that kind of stuff. But what I'm trying to do is sell seats to funders because they're going to be funding it anyway, right? I mean, you can pay for it or your funder can pay for it, but the funder is going to pay for it anyway. And so I've been talking with Danville and Richmond and Southwest Virginia, OBC. A bunch of you are here from OBC, and there's one other that's not in my mind. And to say, do you guys want to fund 1 or 2 seats in this with a couple of nonprofits to see if we can put this into place? Because if it's not prioritized and not funded, it can't happen. You know it needs to happen. It's not as hard as academic program evaluation, but it needs to be put into place, and that takes effort and it takes a learning curve. So those are just some things to sort of put out there. This isn't hard, but I know your brain is full and you're already doing 12 jobs. So how are you going to get it done? Ooh, I also presented it to the Charlottesville Community Foundation. So the more foundations I can talk to, or funding, or corporate CSRs or something that I can talk to, the more I can potentially fund these kinds of positions and get that fractional data capacity out there in just the structure so that you have what you need and not extra. I want to take a couple of minutes and talk about data-driven decisions, because this always makes people stressed out. Anyone here like wondering what a data-driven decision is? I think it feels scary because data feels academic and scary, even if all you have are percentages and bar charts. But you make data-driven decisions every single day, and this is actually exactly the same. So when you do personal budgeting and you're tracking what you spend, and then you look at what you spend each month, you're making data-driven decisions. Oh, look, I spent way too much in entertainment last month. I've got to cut that out because I've got Christmas coming up and I need to be saving money for Christmas. That's a data-driven decision. Grocery shopping, full of data-driven decisions. The data-driven decisions have data in it. So some of it is nutrition, some of it is price, right? Some of it is price per ounce. It also has qualitative data. Will my kids eat it? Did we eat this last time or did it go bad? No, I'm not going to keep buying bags of baby carrots if nobody eats them. Do I like the company that is selling this? Ever since Melania Trump did the posing with the Goya products, I haven't bought Goya anymore. I just can't. I'm very concerned about the fact that Goya had Ivana Trump. One of them. Ivana had these pictures of her holding Goya products, and I was like, oh, I'm not buying any more Goya. So now I have to find different beans. So that's data-driven decision-making. Some of that is based on values, some of it is based on preference, and some of it is based on actual data, what you want, whether you want salt or fat or vegetarian baked beans or something like that. We have lots of democratized data that helps us make decisions now. Like Common Sense Media. If any of you guys have kids and don't know about Common Sense Media, you should totally look at Common Sense Media. It is a way where people go in and rate different like video games and TV shows and movies for like content and appropriateness. And so you can see what the kids rate, what the parents rate, and you can make some decisions about whether or not it's appropriate for your kids based on people's comments. We used it so much that my middle schooler would come to me and they'd say, Mom, Common Sense Media says this, blah, 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 blah. So I feel to go in and look. They were doing their own research before they came to ask me for something. Well, Waze, Airbnb, all of these are democratized data. So you're choosing where you want to stay based on what other people are thinking about it. And that is data-driven decision making. So there's also a difference between asking questions that are interesting and asking questions that are actionable. So an interesting question might be, how many single mothers are we serving? But an actionable question says, are we serving enough of the people most in need? That leads to an action, because the single mothers, you're just saying, up 12, but is that enough of the people in need? Are the people we're serving getting the intended impact? And is that impact the same across different groups? Or are we missing the men? Are we just not serving them? Or they're not doing as well in our programming? When do people typically drop out of our program? So we've got impacts for the people who complete it and do our surveys. But what about the people who drop out? Who's dropping out? It might be nice to look at the people who, the demographics or some other characteristic of the people who completed surveys or completed 5 sessions and the people that didn't. And another question that might be interesting, depending on the type of programming you have, is at what point in the program do people start making progress? So if you're seeing people over the course of a year and you're assessing them every month, when is it that they start to increase? Is it frequency? Is it based on depth of programming, how much of the programming they do, or how often they come? And so here are some of the actions that you might come up with. We need to extend our outreach to some particular group that is not showing up in our data or barely showing up. We need to adjust our programming. So maybe recruit people earlier in the process. Like we're getting people when they get to this state. Maybe we need to see if we can get them at the state before that. Or maybe we need more staff people in order to be able to make those needs. Maybe staff are serving too many people at once. You might gather information from people before the point at which you start having them drop out and ask, how are you doing? What's going on? Which honestly can make them stay. Or you can ask your staff. So we've noticed, like, you know, Nancy, you've served 10 people, but 3 have dropped out. What happened with those 3? And you get that story from her, and then you're able to start thinking about whether or not you need to do something different to capture those people. And honestly, it might not be you need to do more. It might be that you do less. People with X, Y, and Z characteristic might not be ready for your service, and that's okay. Or you might want to make sure that, let's see, at what point do people start to show impact? Ensure that your programming extends, that you really keep people in after that critical point when impact starts to show. These don't apply to every single one of you. Actually, I just did for the VFM, for the Virginia Fresh Match, I just did analyses and sent them to Lene today on all the different surveys that you guys did across the state. And we looked at how many people had been getting SNAP for at least a year, but were using Virginia Fresh Match for like less than 3 months. Because that's an opportunity. That means that there are these people who are using SNAP, but not doubling their produce. Why is that? And so we can look at the data by looking at that intersection. And then I don't know what to do about that, but it is an opportunity for each of the regions in the Virginia Fresh Match group. Other questions or thoughts about this? Oh, forget that little thing, that's for something else. So when you do your action plan and you want to say what you want done, who's going to do it, when they're going to do it, when you're going to have the due date, and when you review the data, right? That's just simple action planning. And that is data analysis. What are y'all's thoughts about where we are at this moment? Who's feeling like they want to nap? I know this is the least interactive, Tanisha. The next ones are very interactive, but I want to make sure I get you all the information.
I would say that I feel like you have given us so many tools and so many, like you've handed this to us. And now it's on us. Like you.
Well, it's on you and or somebody else who you hire to do it, right? Whether it's me or some other person who knows how to do data. But if you don't have these tools, you can't do it because you're just swimming in information.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So it can be structured. It doesn't have to be all over the place.
You
But
can even
I'm
do,
glad.
like, not even for funders, like for example, in my organization, something that I've been saying for a long time, several of us, like these about a specific, about cases, right? Like these are not right. These are not, they keep, why, what's going on with them? Because that's not where you should be going to get cases. Like that's just something we keep. But if we were doing it like this, we wouldn't have to keep screaming that. We could say, listen, you signed up 52 people from that site. And out of those 52, we were only able to reach 10. Month after month after month, where the 59 that you signed up from another site, we've been able to reach 40 of them. We wouldn't have to.
Exactly.
We could just show it, like numbers don't lie.
Yeah.
They say the fastest way to let's get this, fastest way to shut down an opinion is a number or something like that. Fastest way to,
well, what the numbers do,
the fastest way to shut down an opinion is with a number.
yeah, what the numbers do is that they give an opinion some backing, right?
Yeah.
So when you're telling your stories to your funders or your staff, you say, this is what I'm seeing, this is how we're interpreting it, here's the data, let's not do this anymore, or let's do this other thing. And that creates a lot more energy and it makes people feel like they have something to push against. So I don't know about you guys, but you know, when I was in college, which was a very long time, I was in college for like 15 years or something. I was in college. I had no money, right? Because I'm living on stipends and stuff that I'm borrowing and little side jobs and stuff. So I counted my money incredibly carefully. And because I'm a data person, and I entered it into Excel. Back then it was just a green and black screen. There was no mouse, right? Like it was back in the day. But I entered it in so that I could calculate each month how much I was spending. And even though I was the one spending it, and even though there was a limited amount of money, it really helped me to be able to see what those totals were so that I could figure out how to adjust and shift my behavior, which is kind of remarkable since it was all inside of me anyway. And I had my little checkbook. I knew how much money there was left. Checkbook too. I had a little checkbook. I knew how much was left. So the power of being able to look at that data, and even if there's not anything deep to say about it, but just to look at it and say, here's what the data is, that really empowers people to make shifts. I think that's why giving people data in the corporate world helps too, because they have sales goals. And if they have their data, they're more aware of where it is, what goals it is they have to meet, and they're more aware of where they should cut their losses and where they should be investing in leads. And I think it's the same for all of us. Yes. Do you have something else, Gabby?
I did. I wanted to ask you if you could go back to 51. Oh, no, there you are right there. No, there you were. Maybe you hadn't gotten there yet. Right.
Here?
Yeah. you could go back to that and give me an example and how it turns into the story, like a hypothetical one of, miracle messages, an art project, anything. Tell me how this turns into the story.
How the data turns into a story. You want me to spoil next week?
Oh, okay.
No, I'll tell you though.
No,
I'll tell you. So one, the story you just told me about your staff, where we don't want to go to place A anymore, we want to go to place B, because even though we get people from place A, we only get 10%, and in place B, we get 80%. That is a story. It's a story to your staff. Your audience is small, but that's a story. Guys, here's what we need to do. I'm forbidding people to go to place A. We're all going to place B. That's a story.
So
Here's
we've been
another
saying the story without the data to back it up.
without the data.
Okay.
And then what does it do? Sometimes it falls flat, right? People don't move to action. The data, like my personal budget, helps you move, helps you do something. It creates more trust, it creates more energy, and it also benchmarks you so that you're able to see whether things change over time, right? Because there's nothing worse than not being able to see things change over time. There's actually data on weight loss that shows that if you weigh yourself every day, you're more likely to lose weight. Why? Because you're looking at the scale, and the scale's helping you know. You have to do it in a healthy way. If you do it in an unhealthy way, you're anorexic, you have to take your scale away. But if you're doing it in a healthy way, then it helps you be more informed about what's happening in your behavior every day. And so it actually gives you more control over what's going on. Here's another story. Hey, and this is a similar one that I'll present in 2 weeks when we do the actual stories. Hey, funder, we are really successful at reaching, 80% of the kids we serve. And if we had another staff person, we could reach 100%. Because what we know about that 20% that's not being served is that they have higher needs than everybody else. So it doesn't make sense to add them to other people's caseloads. We need a new person in. The example I just gave for the Virginia Fresh Match, we've got, it looks like on average, and I'm making this up, I don't remember the number, but it looks like on average, the people who use Virginia Fresh Match, which doubles your SNAP benefit for fruits and vegetables, so you get 2 carrots for 1. So they get this voucher. If you have SNAP, you can get extra fruits and vegetables. What we've noticed is that 45% of the people who've been using SNAP for at least a year have only just started using Virginia Fresh Match. Maybe that is because, we just started advertising well, and so a bunch of people are showing up. Maybe it's because we're not advertising well at all, and we need to boost our advertising. And so the way you figure out what that action is by collectively coming up with what the story is. The story is that at 2 or 3 of our locations, we really need to boost our advertising, because at those locations, there is a disproportionate number of new BFM users who have had SNAP for at least a year. What are we going to do? I don't know what to do, but you guys are going to know what to do. You're going to have an idea and you're going to try it out. And then next year, you'll see whether or not that proportion has gotten lower. Another story might be a board dashboard that you give to your board every month that shows them how much work you've done. You probably can't give them impact every month unless you're doing turning over lots and lots of people, but you can give them productivity. Here's who we've served. Here's what group they're in. Here's how many people we have on caseloads. Here's how much we've sold. Here's how many workshops we've given. Those kinds of things, you can have a dashboard for your board, and then you go to your board and you tell them the story of the dashboard. Well, everything this month looks just on track, just like the last month, except we have no Hispanic speaking people this month. And that is because our Hispanic speaking service provider is on maternity leave, and we failed to actually plan for that and have somebody here who can speak Spanish. So I'm letting you guys know that as the executive director, I am hiring somebody to come in and do translations for us. It's going to cost a little extra money, but we have to do it because we're not reaching any Spanish speaking people. That's a story too. It's
Great.
exactly what you do with your budget. right? You bring your budget in and you say, yep, everything's the same. That might be the story most of the time, but sometimes you're gonna be like, this is a problem. The price of tomatoes has gone up and now we need to increase our sales price. Comments?
I have a question. You mentioned like counting the amount of times you do something as like a productivity type data. What other categories of data are there? Because that would be different than like doing surveys, and then how often should you be doing each kind of data collection?
Okay, that's a great question. So I do have a really short video on all the different kinds of data that an organization comes in with, and that is in the extra videos section. Because there is a lot of different kind of data. You guys already probably track your development data, you track your budget data, there's HR data, right? How much are people paid? And you know, maybe if you have satisfaction surveys, how satisfied your staff are. There might even be an ED survey that your board, satisfaction survey that your board does. That is what I just mentioned, that is all resourcing data. That's like what you're bringing into the organization and how the organization is running it as a resource. The data that you have that shows the impact is your productivity and your impact. And so productivity, a lot of times organizations are collecting productivity data as they do their work. So people are, how many markets, how many are you serving? How many pounds of food have you given away? How many dollars in produce have been sold? Actually, for you guys, that would be an impact. But how many farmers are you working with? How many different people use the service this month? How many, you might also have data in Gabby's corner on how many people actually succeed in making a match based on who was recruited. So all of that is just the data that you're keeping on who and what how many things are happening at your organization each day. And I don't know what the critical ones are to collect, but your impact map should have those on there, right? At the very least, it's demographics to the extent you can have them. And ideally it should be some sort of amount of service provided. How much are you putting out there? And then your impact is when you survey people or you observe an impact, or you might observe an achievement, or you do a survey and you get that survey data back. And you might have periods of time at which you're still doing surveys. So like in Virginia Fresh Match, there's an annual time that there's surveys, the rest of the time there aren't surveys, because it's very impractical. You can't go to every farmer's market and ask people to do surveys all year. Everybody would be mad. So we go in and we do them every summer. Just everybody gets a few. And then, so then the impact data would only be processed once a year, because that's when your data comes in. But the productivity data comes from all the farmers markets. So LEAP, which is the hub for Virginia Fresh Match, they're collecting data from all the outlets every month on how much they're selling. So they can look monthly, providing that people are reporting the data quickly enough, and tell how much is being sold, what the productivity is. But they don't know what the impact is on their customers until they do the survey annually. So I always say that you should be collecting productivity data as you do your work, right? There should be some place that you're entering that data. A lot of times it's Google Sheets, because Google Sheets is accessible to everyone in your organization. And you can have people go in at the end of the day and put how much work they did, how many people did you see, Or you might have it not by your staff, but you might have it by individual. So, Carla, how many times if we make a mark every time she comes in. But then the impact data is going to happen either at some regular interval when it's important to sort of look at impact for people, how they're doing over time. So if you have a school program, maybe quarterly, or if you might be doing it annually with whoever is available at that annualness to ask them that survey or to look at their achievements. It might be when they exit, they do a survey and you look at their achievements. And you're entering that data, might be in the same place. It's probably some different places. It depends on how complicated your data is. But a lot of times you have some productivity sheets, and then you have impact sheets, and those are sort of put in different places. Because the productivity you're just collecting every day and the impact you're collecting periodically. Does that help?
Yeah, that is extremely helpful. Thank you.
Any other questions? We never get to this because I haven't quite perfected what the exact right amount of information is, but these are the points that we went over today. So the 3 steps in turning your data into action, not just knowledge, what formulas you need, what graphs you need, and basically how an insight and learning team goes. So it's a lot of little tiny pieces of information, but it's actually just sort of like 4 chunks. This is all the information in your workbook that I looked over earlier with you guys. And then I would encourage you, while this is fresh, to go in and just open the Excel workbook. It is in the folder for this class, and you can just click on the links and watch a couple of the videos and watch it go through, so that it stops feeling like a bunch of scattered pieces and you're able to build a little coherence around it before it leaves you. And then next week, we're going to do really fun data visualization. And then the week after that, we're going to do how you stick it all together into a data story. And we will do a little reflecting. And so at that last session, I'll ask you to bring back your goals if you have them, because I'm interested in what you got. If you got what you expected and what your next steps are going to be, we'll do a little bit of planning. And then if you have any funders that you want me to talk to about data capacity, whether it's me coming in and doing that 2-year coaching or whether it's that fractional person, please reach out to me, because the more people I have talking to funders about how important it is, the more likely it is that I'm able to sort of pull it together. My goal, I say this for Kelly's benefit, is I would love to have these people in regional centers for nonprofit excellence. And then I run the program and the funder funds it. So it's a partnership between me supervising and helping to evolve the program and the CNE, because it's a capacity building service, and the funder kind of all together meeting the community's needs. Last questions? I am going to turn off the recording, and I'm here for 15 minutes or potentially longer if anyone has things they want to talk about. Oh my goodness. Oh yes, good.